says this unmanned drone was in international airspace. Iran says it shot it down. The Revolutionary Guard says it shot it down because it crossed the line and violated Iranian airspace. So Iran says it was a provocation. The Pentagon says it was unprovoked. Again, we're going to get some key details on this in just a moment. As we wait, I want to check in live at the White House with CNN's Abby Phillip. Abby, the president is in a meeting with his top advisors trying to sort out what to do. He calls it a very big mistake. That normally means there will be a very big response. Do we know anything about the options the president is considering?
Well, John, I don't think we really know where this is all heading, because the contours of this problem for President Trump are, for several weeks now, he has been pushing back against his advisors, pushing back against the idea that he might be dragged into some kind of conflict with Iran. Remember, just earlier this week, he called an earlier attack by Iran on some oil tankers a very minor incident, and our sources were telling us that inside the White House, the president has been downplaying all of these acts of aggression or attention-seeking or whatever you want to call it from Iran. But today the question is, does this incident with the drone change the dynamic for the president? We don't know yet, and we may not know until the president's aides have had a chance to really debrief him on all of what's going on here. But we do know that this is a president who is very resistant to this. He does not think that this is in his interest, but he has a lot of hawkish advisors. The Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, his National Security Advisor, John Bolton, and then he has what seems to be a very big power vacuum over at the Pentagon, where there is so much turmoil in the senior leadership. So I think we are just waiting to see whether this is enough to change his mind. He has previously said that he would go to war with Iran over nuclear weapons. On the other stuff, he called it a big question mark. This is the part that is a big question mark. And as the administration takes on a more aggressive posture in response to all of this, the question always will come back to the commander-in-chief as the decider in the situation. Where does he come down on this? And I think we'll find out in the coming minutes and hours. He is at the moment meeting with the Canadian Prime Minister on a slew of somewhat separate issues, but it could be our first opportunity to hear from him this morning, John.
Abby Phillip at the White House. We will stay in touch throughout the hour. Again, we're told this Pentagon briefing being streamed in from Central Command headquarters will begin any minute now. As we wait, I want to go to Ryan Brown live at the Pentagon. Ryan, forgive me if I have to interrupt you for this briefing, but the president says it is a very big mistake. The Pentagon says there is no doubt, in its view, this drone was in international airspace when it was shot down by surface-to-air missiles. What are we expecting from this briefing?
Well, John, we're being told that the commander of all air operations in the Middle East will be briefing, and we're told that to expect information about where the drone was located. We're told altitude, distance from land, evidence the Pentagon says that will clearly show that the aircraft was in international airspace when it was shot down by this Iranian missile. Now, the type of drone is worth noting. It's an RQ-4. It's one of the largest drones in the U.S. fleet. It's massive. You don't use this kind of thing to do clandestine operations, so it would be extremely unusual for it to have intentionally been sent into Iranian airspace for some kind of spying operation. So again, the U.S. military feeling very confident that this was in fact an international airspace. Iran taking credit for shooting it down, claiming that it had strayed into Iranian airspace. The Pentagon going to attempt to make its case this hour.
Ryan, stand by as well, obviously. And again, we're waiting for the briefing any second. CNN is blessed to have our Fred Pleitgen live in the Iranian capital of Tehran. Fred, we have had in past stories, past instances, where sometimes the Revolutionary Guard gets out over its skis, if you will. We have a Revolutionary Guard statement taking responsibility, saying that this drone, in its view, crossed into Iranian airspace. Are we hearing from other aspects and elements of the Iranian government, or is the Revolutionary Guard taking the lead here?
Hi, John. Well, the Revolutionary Guard certainly took the lead very early on after this happened. It was quite interesting to see, because usually they're quite a secretive organization, but the head of the Revolutionary Guard, he came out very early in the morning hours and confirmed that, yes, this drone had been shot down, made quite a bellicose statement saying that, quote, this was the way that Iran deals with its enemies. But now, as the day progresses, there are other elements of the Iranian government that are making statements as well. And it was quite interesting to see, because just a couple of minutes after President Trump made his, or tweeted his first response that Iran had made a big mistake, Iran's foreign minister has now come out and tweeted a tweet of his own. He said, this is a quote, "The U.S. wages economic terrorism on Iran. That's the Iranians referring to the U.S. leaving the nuclear agreement and levying sanctions on Iran, has conducted covert action against us and now encroaches on our territory. We don't seek war, but will zealously defend our skies, land, and waters. We'll take this new aggression to the UN and show the U.S. is lying about international waters. So the Iranians, from their side at least, are saying that they're also quite confident that they believe that the drone was shot down over their territory. And John, just another word from the Iranians, because they have used some very, very strong language throughout the day. One of the things that the head of the Revolutionary Guard also said earlier today, he said, while Iran does not want war, he said the shooting down of this drone also makes very clear that Iran is absolutely ready for war. John?
Fred Pleitgen, live in Tehran. Fred, please stay with us as well. Again, we're waiting for Lieutenant General from Central Command to brief any moments now. It will be an audio briefing, not a video briefing, but we'll bring you to the details live as soon as it starts to happen. That's why you're watching the Pentagon briefing room on the right of your screen. Meanwhile, let's discuss in the room here, joining me to share their reporting and their insights, CNN's Kylie Atwood, CNN's Phil Mattingly, our military and diplomatic affairs analyst, retired Rear Admiral John Kirby, and Eliana Johnson with Politico. Admiral, I want to start with you. You've stood at that podium. You've stood at the State Department. You were part of putting the Iran nuclear deal together. I just want to put your Pentagon hat on at the moment.
Sure.
If they have the evidence that this drone was in international airspace, then it is an unprovoked attack over international airspace by Iran. If you're sitting in a room and the president wants options, what would they be?
From a military perspective, he would certainly be in his right, because this is a technical hostile act in international airspace, in his right to invoke Article 51 of the UN Charter, which is the right of self-defense. Now, there's two things about that. It has to be of necessity, and I think they can prove the point that there's a necessity for self-defense, and then it has to be proportional. And so what does that mean? Well, that's where you get into all the difficulties and the complications of what options are before you.
Shot with a surface-to-air missile. Do you take out a missile launcher?
Well, here's the thing. So they have proven now that they can shoot with accuracy and with great range into this international airspace. So now you have to consider that anything within the range of Iranian air defenses is contested airspace, even if it's international, which further constrains your military options.
And Kylie, to you, from the State Department perspective, this is a major, risky, dangerous, I could keep adding adjectives, escalation. Iran shooting down a U.S. drone. It comes at a time of enormous mistrust between the United States and Iran, 1,000 troops on their way. The Pentagon saying there is no doubt, the Secretary of State saying there's no doubt that Iran was responsible for the attacks on those tankers. But you do see, when you call around the world to even traditional strong U.S. allies, some skepticism, some doubt. We want to see more evidence. How important is it that the Pentagon here clear up any doubt? And I want to tell our viewers, you're watching Justin Trudeau on the right there with President Trump. It's the left of your screen, but on the right of that photo, the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, going into a previously scheduled meeting at the White House. There is this trust deficit. So I find it interesting and of the moment, if you will, that the Pentagon decided so quickly to come forward and have this briefing where Ryan Brown tells us they want to lay out the ping data. They want to show us here's where this drone was. The Iranians are lying.
And that is different than what we've been seeing. This has been escalating, these threats, these assaults from Iran, right? First, they went after commercial ships in the region. Then they went after some pipelines, oil pipelines going into Saudi Arabia. Then they went after oil tankers in the region. They have truly been escalating, but the U.S., the Trump administration, has not been laying out their evidence quite explicitly as we expect that they could do today. Obviously, we did see some evidence that they rolled out when it came to the attack on the oil tankers, but today they're showing that when you go after a U.S. asset, they are going to come forth and provide some evidence as to what they've seen and potentially how they're going to react. But we don't know how the president's going to react yet.
We don't know. And one of the things the president sometimes likes is this uncertainty, this debate, this unpredictability about how he handles foreign crises. And he likes, he says, the fact that there's wide disagreement sometime among his advisors. At a moment like this, hours after a drone has been shot out of the sky, that uncertainty, unpredictability can add to the confusion, the complications, and the risk of a miscalculation. We know that John Bolton, for example, the National Security Advisor, on record for years, saying he believes you need to have regime change. Mike Pompeo, a hawk when it comes to Iran. The president, in several interviews recently, trying to dial everybody back, saying there's nothing to worry about, I don't want war. If they went nuclear, then there might be a war, but I want to try to find something out. What do we make of sort of the, I don't mean to trivialize this, but the who's on first aspect of this?
Well, I think it's important to note that the president himself has been the one pumping the brakes about responding to the three previous incidents. And administration officials have noted that, but have also said that they are drawing the line at striking an American asset. And it's interesting, they made the point that the Iranians had been very careful up until today, but any attack on an American ship or an American citizen would demand a response. And so I think this is sort of Trump's red line moment. Administration officials, though not the president himself, had drawn this red line. Iran seems to have crossed it. Now what will the president do? He's been by far the most reluctant. Now I think the point of this briefing here is when the president is by his nature divisive. I think the point of this briefing here, not conducted by the president himself, but by a military official, is to unite the country, I think, in an attempt to unite the country in agreement behind what happened and then behind a potential response by laying out the evidence of what happened.
Yeah, the question is the potential part. He's getting a lot of advice off the Capitol Hill, the turf you walk.
To follow up on that point, I think it's an important one in terms of the public aspect of this. You've seen a similar mechanisms kick into gear behind the scenes on Capitol Hill, where you had early on in this process a lot of Democrats in particular skeptical whether there was actual intelligence, whether the intelligence was good enough. Over the course of the last 4 days, you've seen the administration really take a very traditional path of briefings, both classified briefings, public briefings to Republican officials as well, Democrat and Republican. What I've been struck by is even skeptical Democrats that I've spoken to who have seen the classified intelligence have started to pull back a little bit on their
To interrupt, Phil, I want to take it straight over to the Pentagon here.
What we're going to do is we have Lieutenant General Joseph Gusella, who is the commander of U.S. Air Force's Central Command. He's calling us from the Combined Air Operations Center, Al Udeid, Qatar. He's going to make a brief statement on last night's shoot down. And at this time, he's not going to take any questions, but we'll hopefully be coming back to you guys with some more information later today. So, General.
Jonathan, can we ask you why no questions?
Hello. Hello, good afternoon. This is Lieutenant General Joseph Guastella, Commander of the U.S. Air Force's Central Command. I'm prepared to give a statement, but I won't be answering questions at this time. A U.S. Navy RQ-4 was flying over the Gulf of Oman and the Strait of Hormuz on a recent surveillance mission in international airspace in the vicinity of recent IRGC maritime attacks when it was shot down by an IRGC surface-to-air missile fired from a location in the vicinity of Goruk, Iran. This was an unprovoked attack on a U.S. surveillance asset that had not violated Iranian airspace at any time during its mission. This attack is an attempt to disrupt our ability to monitor the area following recent threats to international shipping and the free flow of commerce. Iranian reports that this aircraft was shot down over Iran are categorically false. The aircraft was over the Strait of Hormuz and fell into international waters. At the time of the intercept, the RQ-4 was operating at high altitude, approximately 34 kilometers from the nearest point of land on the Iranian coast. This dangerous and escalatory attack was irresponsible and occurred in the vicinity of established air corridors between Dubai, UAE, and Muscat, Oman, possibly endangering innocent civilians. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll have this available for download.
You're listening there to Lieutenant General Joseph Guastella. He's the Air Force commander for Central Command in the region, speaking from a U.S. military base in Qatar, waiting to see if any Pentagon officials come back out to add any more information. It does not look like that at the moment. Forgive me if this gets a little rough. This is what happens in the unpredictability of these things. But we're going to wait. Barbara Starr's in the room. She'll get back to us shortly. Admiral Kirby, I want to come back to you. We talked heading into this briefing of how specific would they be about the evidence. You have a lieutenant general on the record saying this drone was in international space. He laid out the parameters with the map. You can see it here. But we don't have, and my question is, do we need, because of the mistrust between the two governments, the United States and Iran, because of the skepticism many of the allies have about this standoff with Iran, and we could have a broader conversation about years of the Trump withdrawal from JCPOA. Do we need more data than that, or was that enough?
I frankly think they're going to need more. I mean, that map it's a fabricated map. I mean, they put the dot on there. It's not, they're not showing the actual data analysis.
And I just, again, for viewers who don't know, just think about your GPS in your car, your GPS in an airplane, then multiply it by 1,000 because it's military sophisticated technology.
Right.
They have ping data. They could show us a map that clearly proves, that shows us where this drone was every second of the mission.
They could have shown the flight path a little bit better than this. This I don't think is going to satisfy international curiosity and concern. I think it was also a mistake not to take questions. I understand what the Pentagon's thinking. Hey, we're just laying out the facts. We don't want to get drawn into the politics of this thing. They could have avoided those kinds of questions, but I think they should have taken questions and provided a little bit more context. So I'm disappointed that, I'm glad that they briefed. I'm disappointed that it wasn't more fulsome.
And just from that map, I believe this is a Defense Department map that they put up. So this comes from them, not us. But just if you're unfamiliar with the region or you just need to be refreshed, just look at how crowded this is. I mean, think about this. Number one, even if you took all the military ships out, think about the commercial traffic back and forth, largely oil, not all oil and energy, but back and forth. Then you add the Iranian military, you add the U.S. military, you add other militaries in the neighborhood, then you add the recent escalation of recent days. It is a remarkable tense time, and the Pentagon doesn't want to take questions. They just want to lay out their case that this was unprovoked and this drone had every right to be where it was. From your service, what's it like in that little narrow space right now?
I mean, I back when I was a young officer, a long, long time ago, I helped escort Kuwaiti tankers in and out of that strait. Even then, it was crowded and dangerous. It's 10 times more so now because the capabilities of militaries all in the region, including Iran, are far more sophisticated than they were before. That they could shoot this down, this drone, at that distance with that accuracy is not insignificant, and it is an escalation. So it's a very dangerous time right now. And I think what worries me, John, is that the president's decision space gets further limited and smaller. And some of it's on his own doing in the fact that his own team is not on the same page, but also now the Iranians are closing that decision space and they're pushing him into a corner, and I don't think that's good for anybody.
You have a test of wills, and to that point about the president's options, he's in a meeting as we speak with the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau. CNN's Abby Phillip is live at the White House. Abby, I understand this question, what are you going to do, Mr. President, has come up.
One of the reporters got a little bit of a question into the president. Are we going to war with Iran? And the president's answer, as he often does, is you'll soon find out. So absolutely no details from the president, but he's clearly really stringing this along. He is not trying to tamp down the conversation about war. He's saying, we'll let you know soon, but we also know that he just had a meeting with his national security team. Vice President Mike Pence also attended that meeting. So the president is continuously getting this information about what is going on with the situation. The question is, when is he going to let everyone know? Is he going to let Capitol Hill know, frankly, if war is in the future for this? But all he had to say to the reporter in response to that question, that very direct question, was, you'll soon find out. And the president is always one to sort of leave it open-ended, and I think he's clearly doing that in this case on a very sensitive topic, but not in any way trying to tamp down any talk of an escalation in tensions with Iran as a result of the situation, John.
Abby Phillip live at the White House. Let's go over across the river now, live to the Pentagon. Barbara Starr. Barbara, you were in that briefing. You tried, thank you, to get the Pentagon official to stay and actually answer more questions. Lieutenant General Costello there, I hope I'm not mispronouncing his name, laying out the case that in his view, and there's no reason to doubt him, that this drone was in international airspace, that this was an unprovoked Iranian attack in airspace where that drone had every right to be. But does the Pentagon feel pressure, Barbara, to give us more visible proof of where this drone was?
Well, I think that they do, especially if the president were to make a decision to have some kind of military option to respond to this. They are going to want to demonstrate to the world, look, they would have the radar track, all the telemetry, if you will, all the electronic signals of where this drone was flying. The general making the case, as Ryan Brown reported a short time ago, that it was 30 kilometers off the coast of Iran, which would have been proof that it was in international airspace. And he talked a little bit about being in these established air corridors that the other Gulf nations use, and the shoot down put a lot of civilians at risk. You were talking about air corridors, maritime corridors of transit. You're talking about cities along the coastal regions of the Persian Gulf. So look, the Pentagon not prepared to, making it very clear, they're not prepared to answer any questions about this because they know just across the river, the president at this hour is talking and leaving that door open. What we know up until now is that the president has been very reluctant publicly to go down the path of a military option against Iran. But the question on the table today is, did this shoot down really change the calculation? The Iranians shot down a U.S. asset in international airspace. Thankfully, no pilot on board. This was a drone. Thankfully, it fell apparently into the sea. No one hurt. But they directly did challenge the United States this time. And the question for the president now is to get some options, which we know he's getting from his military advisors, and decide what, if anything, he wants to do about it, John.
And Barbara, let me ask you as a follow-up. He's getting those options at a time anyone following the news in recent days knows the defense secretary who was already acting is leaving to be replaced by a new acting defense secretary who was the secretary of the Army. So there's been some turnover, some say chaos at the top of the Pentagon, but obviously the military staff is an established career official staff. Do we know anything about how would the military define proportional response? And B, does the personnel turnover at the top and uncertainty at the top have any impact on the quality and the speed with which the president will get that list of options?
Well, let's start with that very question at the top. The acting defense secretary, Patrick Shanahan, leaves office at midnight on Sunday. The new acting secretary, Mark Esper, we believe joined them at the White House today. He is within days of taking over. He's an experienced hand. He's been the Army secretary. But once again, we have someone stepping onto the international stage here for the Trump administration in a time of military crisis. So we also know that the National Security Advisor, John Bolton, the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, have been very welcoming, shall we say, of the notion of a military option against Iran. It's the president who perhaps has been listening to his military advisors, such as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dunford, who are saying, look, if you want to go against Iran, you have to have a strategy, you have to have a policy, and you have to fashion a military force to enact a military goal. This is the problem all the time, whether it's North Korea or Venezuela or today it's Iran. What do you want to use military force to accomplish? And I can tell you that very senior military people today in the Pentagon are concerned about this because they can't predict what Iran's response would be, what the regime and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps response would be if the U.S. conducted what it thought was a proportional strike to answer back on this drone shoot down. How would the Iranians react? What would they do? Are U.S. forces in the region well protected enough at this hour if there was to be a military response? And if you start down the road of military action against Iran and you want to ultimately make them get rid of their nuclear program, there is a very strong view at the highest levels of the U.S. military that you are talking about going down the road of regime change in Iran, that is what some of the top political appointees of the Trump administration ultimately want, regime change. And the U.S. military will tell you chapter and verse. They have lived through Afghanistan, they've lived through Iraq, Syria, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban. They are very familiar. Regime change comes at a steep human cost. It can take decades. And after decades at war, there is still so much uncertainty in the wars we're in. The president knows he's headed into a political campaign. He has run on the notion of getting out of wars. We know he does not want to make a large troop commitment overseas. So right now, the president has quite an interesting decision to make. Can he feel confident enough to engage in some kind of limited military strike against Iran for the drone shoot down and not risk a wider confrontation with Tehran? John?
Barbara Starr live at the Pentagon. The president says you'll soon find out. Let's check back in with Fred Pleitgen, who is in Tehran. Fred, it was just a week or so, 10 days ago, maybe a little longer than that, the president of the United States was saying, I wish they'd call, urging the Iranian leadership to pick up the phone and call. Now we are in a potential military confrontation with the Pentagon briefer saying Iran is lying, that this drone was in international airspace, and the president of the United States saying you'll find out soon what he decides to do about options. How is that going to play in Iran?
Well, I think the Iranians, John, have been saying for a while that they don't want this to escalate, but at the same time they're saying they're ready for any sort of escalation. I think there's a lot of things that are really interesting in that play right now, and I was just listening to Barbara Starr, who obviously laid it out perfectly, and I think one of the things that Barbara said is absolutely correct, is that the U.S. at this point does not know what's going to happen if they do strike back. And I can tell you, I've been speaking to commanders of the Revolutionary Guard. I've been speaking to former high-level commanders of the Revolutionary Guard. And the one thing they kept telling me again and again and again is, look, the Americans need to understand that if it does come to a shooting war between Iran and the United States, it would not only be a war between the U.S. and Iranian forces, but it would also involve Iranian proxy forces around the Middle East. And there's one statement from one former commander that keeps ringing, and that's he said the Americans need to understand that next to almost every American military base in the greater Middle Eastern region, there is a pro-Iranian proxy force that could very well then destabilize the situation or endanger U.S. forces in that region. So that's certainly something that needs to be calculated. And at the same time, the Iranians also today went to great pains to try and prove their point, to try and say that they believe that this drone was indeed in their airspace. We just saw that map that the Pentagon put out. The Iranians a couple of hours ago put out a very similar map that also had one single dot on it as well, showing where they said that this drone had landed and where it was shot down. They have the dot obviously a little bit further east over their own airspace, and now they say they want to take all this to the United Nations and make their own case. So they're probably speaking to their own audience here at home, but at the same time also, of course, trying to drum up support for their side of things. But I think both sides are pretty clear about the fact is that if this does get out of control, there is a war between the U.S. and Iran. It's going to be a very, very messy affair. And that's certainly something that the Iranians have been saying again and again. Jawad Zarif said it today. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard commander said it as well. This is maybe a technologically more inferior, as far as the military technology is concerned, nation than the U.S. has. I'm pretty sure that the Abraham Lincoln Aircraft Carrier Strike Group, which is in this area, probably has more combat-ready jets than the entire Iranian Air Force. But the Iranians have those ground militia forces that they have. They've shown today that their anti-aircraft systems at least work. And what they always keep saying is they also have this ballistic missile program, which they say has gotten a lot more advanced as well. So those would all be considerations that would have to feed into how the Pentagon or how the U.S. is going to respond to all this. The Iranians, for their part, are saying they're ready. And finally, John, the Iranians essentially are saying, look, the Trump administration is in this situation because of themselves. They're the ones who left the nuclear agreement. And a couple of, I think it was about a week ago, the Prime Minister of Japan was here in Tehran, and he brought that message from President Trump asking for talks with the Iranian leadership, and the Iranian leadership said absolutely not. We had a deal with the United States. We had a deal with the Obama administration. The U.S. left that deal, and now Iran is not willing to speak, despite the fact that the sanctions that have been levied against Iran are very detrimental to this country's economy. A lot of people have lost their jobs. The civilian population is suffering a great deal. I've been walking the streets of Tehran a lot in the past couple of days, and people have been telling me how difficult it is for them. Despite that, the Iranians say, we are not going to talk to this president because he left the Iran nuclear deal and brought America and brought himself into this situation.
Fred Pleitgen live for us importantly, and we're very lucky in Tehran. Fred, appreciate that. Come back to us if there's any more response to either the president or the Pentagon. Let's come back into the room. We could have for months and weeks and more an argument about, pulling out of the JCPOA, whether the Trump administration increased tensions. But we're in the here and now. Right. And the administration says, whatever the reason, that it has proof Iran blew up those tankers. The administration says, and Iran admits, it shot down that drone. Whether you're mad at President Trump for pulling out of an agreement doesn't give you the right to blow up tankers and to shoot drones out of the sky. Right. So the question is, what now? What now? We've talked in recent days about there's no circuit breaker any of us can see, who's a third party that would intervene to calm things down. What about if there's 1,000 troops on their way? The president announced that in response to the tankers. What is the U.S. military footprint there right now? I assume everybody is on a higher alert now than the high alert they were on just hours ago.
I have no doubt that they are. Tens of thousands of troops in the region. These extra 1,000 are really just to support reconnaissance aircraft and force protection needs. So they're not really offensive in nature. But I think the other thing we should be asking, John, is what about the Europeans? The Iranians may have overplayed their hand here by going after a sovereign U.S. military aircraft in international airspace. The Europeans were not inclined to want to side with Trump in this economic battle. the Iranians are making it harder now on the Europeans to stay on their side and to try to keep the deal in place. And I also wonder to the degree to which the Revolutionary Guard is sort of out in front of the civil state government. If you read Zarif's tweet, he's trying to kind of pull it back. He's saying, hey, we're going to go to the UN, we're going to complain, this is all about economic warfare. I think there's divisions inside Iran that we also need to be careful about in terms of the potential escalation and miscalculation going forward.
But that this is a uniquely personal, singular decision for the commander-in-chief, who, as we talked a bit earlier, often gets debating advice. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong to have a big mix of opinions in the room. But this one is on him. And so does he decide this is an opportunity to maybe rebuild those relationships with the Europeans on this issue, to your point, saying, we have proof they shot down our drone. Whatever you think about what I did last week, last month, and last year, we're at a moment of crisis. You need to stand with the United States. Exactly. Increase sanctions, do something diplomatically. Right. Or does the president listen? He'll hear it from Lindsey Graham on Capitol Hill. He'll hear it from Tom Cotton. He may hear it from his national security advisor. They shot down a drone. We need to take something out to prove this is a test of wills, and you need to show them you're tough.
Well, it doesn't have to be either or. At least I hope it's not. I do think you're right, and I think there's an opening here for the Trump administration to finally maybe get some of the international partners on board after what Iran has done now in the last week. But it doesn't have to be either or, like you come along with us for more economic and diplomatic pressure, or we're going to conduct a retaliatory strike. There are military options that can be played out that are not provocative, not offensive, but demonstrable enough to try to further deter Iran. So far they've been unsuccessful, but there are other things that they haven't done that they could do.
But it is also important, I think, to note that over the next week, we have Brian Hook, who is the special representative to Iran at the State Department, heading to the Middle East. He's not going to meet with Europeans. He's going to meet with the UAE. He's going to meet with Bahrain and Saudi Arabia to talk to them about this. And then we also have John Bolton on Sunday going to Israel, and he's going to be meeting with his Israeli counterpart and his Russian counterpart. So we don't see any proactive outreach to the Europeans, at least at this point. However, both of those trips were planned before this attack actually happened.
But it just reinforces, again, you could peel this onion for months, years, and decades, in the sense that it's an incredibly complicated neighborhood that is now even more complicated, whether we're talking about the civil war in Yemen, whether we're talking about other tensions in the neighborhood, whether we're talking about the Khashoggi murder in Saudi Arabia. Sam Kiley is one of our CNN International correspondents. He's in the United Arab Emirates. Sam, just from your perspective, this military confrontation at an already incredibly complicated time in the region, a little perspective from your end, and then more on the discussion of if you're the citizens of the United States now, and you see that Iran shot down a drone, and you're hearing the president say, you'll find out soon if there'll be a military response. More perspective on the U.S. military footprint there.
Well, John, first in the terms of the regional reaction, there is great enthusiasm for the Trump policy towards Iran in the UAE, here in the Emirates, where I am, in Saudi Arabia, in Bahrain, obviously in Israel. But as Fred was pointing out, there are a great number of vulnerabilities in terms of particularly the Shia population that is spread through Iraq and Syria in particular, and into South Lebanon. And on top of that, there is deep cynicism, whichever side of the Islamic Sunni Shia divide that people sit on at the popular level over the actions of the United States of America anywhere in the Middle East. So the downing of a drone will be seen as the death of a robot, not of an individual. It will not be seen in the broader Middle East as an act of war. It'll be seen as an act of defiance. I think that there'll probably be a degree of schadenfreude directed at the Americans, even by the enemies of Iran, at little Iran striking a bit of a blow and downing a very expensive high-tech piece of equipment with technology that is homegrown. So I think that's something that will play very significantly on the minds of the leaderships, even in these authoritarian Gulf monarchies. And then on the wider issue, the extent of military capability, again, as Fred was indicating, but it really is important to get this across. The Iranians have a capacity to absorb pain that is really quite terrifying. Remember, 1 million people on each altogether died in the Iran-Iraq war, with wave upon wave upon wave of almost unarmed, in some cases, Iranian fighters hitting the Iraqis, who had at that time the backing of the West. They'll also recall, John, that the downing of an Iranian airliner by the USS Vincennes over the Straits of Hormuz did not result in a conflict between the United States and Iran, and that was the death.
Sam, I'm sorry I need to interrupt. We need to take you to the Oval Office of the President of the United States with the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau.
No, Iran made a big mistake. This drone was in international waters. Clearly, we have it all documented. It's documented scientifically, not just words. And they made a very bad mistake.
How will you respond, Mr. President? How will you respond?
You'll find out.
Are you willing to go to war with Iran?
You'll find out. You'll find out. I mean, obviously, you know, we're not going to be talking too much about it. You're going to find out. They made a very big mistake.
Mr. President, what are your concerns about China and the Canadians who are detained, sir?
No concerns. We'll be discussing that. It'll be one of the issues I think we'll be discussing right now with Justin.
Mr. President, the Fed made no change to the interest rate.
Say it?
The Fed made no change to the interest rate. Right?
Well, I guess they indicated they're going to be lower. He should have done sooner, but what are you going to do? Can't win them all. He should have done it sooner, but you can't win it all. And eventually he'll do what's right, perhaps. Let's see what he does.
Would you ask China to release the Canadians? Would you ask China to release the Canadians? Do you intend to bring them up when you meet with
Obviously, we're very concerned about the escalation by Iran recently. We have significant presence in the area, including leading on the NATO mission in Baghdad, in Iraq. We look forward to discussing with our closest ally their perspectives on this and how we can move forward as an international community.
Will you ask China to release the Canadians, sir?
Meeting with Xi Jinping. Will you help Justin Trudeau get a meeting with Xi Jinping at the G20 next week to talk about the detainees?
Well, I don't know that he's trying to meet. Are you trying to get a meeting?
We've got a lot of things to discuss.
Well, otherwise I'll represent him well. I will tell you. We have a meeting set up with President Xi, and it's obviously on the big transaction that we're talking about and negotiating. Our people are actually speaking now. We'll see what happens with that. But anything I can do to help Canada, I will be doing.
What's your message on Huawei to Canada?
Excuse me?
Are you planning to bring it up with President Xi when you meet with him?
I would, at Justin's request, I will absolutely bring that.
When USMCA is ratified, sir, will that be the end
Don't
of
say
tariffs?
when.
When it is ratified.
Don't say when, because so far I have to get the Democrats to approve it. All right. So I like your positive thinking, but if. And the if is really subject to the Democrats. Let's see what happens. But I really believe that Nancy Pelosi and the House will approve it. I think the Senate will approve it rapidly. It's going to be very bipartisan. It's great for the farmers, manufacturers. It's really great for everybody. And unions. It's great for unions. I mean, we have tremendous union support, too. It's a tremendous, it really is, it shows a partnership between three countries. And it's sort of three countries in a trade sense. We're competing with the European Union. We're competing with China. It gives us a bigger dialogue. It gives us a much bigger platform. It's really good for all three. It's something that's very popular. I hope politically they can do what they have to do. Now, a day after the election, it would win with a tremendous support. But we have an election coming up. But I think Nancy Pelosi is going to do the right thing.
And will that be the end of tariffs on Canada and Mexico?
Well, we'll see. I mean, you know, they have to do what they have to do. We understand that. We can't have big, tremendous shipments of certain products, so we understand that very well.
We were very pleased with the lifting of the tariffs on steel and aluminum.
They've been lifted, as you know, and there won't be, hopefully, transshipping. If there's transshipping, I'll call Justin, and I'm sure he'll take care of it. And if he doesn't I'll probably call him a second time, and if he doesn't, then we'll have to talk, right? But I think that that situation is very well taken care of. Very important for both countries and for all three countries, the farmers, very, very important. More so in that case from us and Canada. But the farmers are really happy with it. The manufacturers are very happy. Mexico is thrilled. You saw the vote. It was a very lopsided in a positive way vote, a great vote. And I think it's going to be something very special. Again, it's the largest trade deal by far ever entered into, and we're very close to having finalized. It means a lot of jobs for our country, a lot of wealth for all three countries, and we're really competing against the world. You know, we're not competing with each other so much. This brings us into a position where we're not competing with each other. We're competing against the world, and that's what we're doing. We're competing against big sections of the world, including Asia and including other areas, and I think it's going to be very special. I think it's going to end up being a very important deal, but the biggest ever made.
Will you invite the Toronto Raptors to the White House? Will you invite the Toronto Raptors to the White House? I'm from the Toronto Star.
Well, we thought about that. That's an interesting question. They played phenomenal basketball. I watched a little bit of it. They were really terrific. Congratulations, by the way. That was a great job by a great team. So we'll think about that. If they'd like to do it, we'll think about that. We have a lot of other folks coming. And the Presidential Medal, I just spoke to him. We're going to be presenting the Presidential Medal of Freedom to Roger Penske. Roger Penske is a great gentleman who has won 18 Indianapolis 500s. He's just won Daytona. He won Daytona, he won Indianapolis, he won probably more than anybody in the history of racing. I can't imagine anybody even being close. But Roger Penske is going to be getting the Medal of Freedom, and he's very thrilled to be getting it, and that'll be announced over the next little while, but I guess actually I'm announcing it pretty much now, but they'll be putting something out. They'll be putting something out in a little while. He's very deserving. He's a great gentleman. I've known him a long time. And a very brilliant guy. When you think of all the countries that want to win Indianapolis and Daytona, and they fight and they spend, even Canada, they spend a lot of money, and when a man wins Indianapolis, when he wins it 18 times, and he just won the Daytona, and he won many things over the course of years, and he's become a very successful man. We talked about electric cars today. I think nobody knows more about that subject in terms of common sense than Roger Penske. So Roger Penske will be getting and receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom.
Mr. President, you said Iran is a different country. Do you still hold that opinion?
Oh, absolutely. When I came here, Iran was in 14 to 18 different sites of confliction. They were extremely hostile. They were hostile when they signed the deal. They were screaming death to America. And I think probably Iran made a mistake. I would imagine it was a general or somebody that made a mistake in shooting that drone down. And fortunately, that drone was unarmed. There was no man in it. It was over international waters, clearly over international waters, but we didn't have a man or woman in the drone. We had nobody in the drone.
Are you still open?
It would have made a big difference, let me tell you. Would have made a big, big difference. But I have a feeling, I may be wrong and I may be right, but I'm right a lot. I have a feeling that it was a mistake made by somebody that shouldn't have been doing what they did.
Who do you think did
I think
that?
they made a mistake. And I'm not just talking to the country made a mistake. I think that somebody under the command of that country made a big
Are you
mistake.
still open to talking to Iran's leadership?
Let's just see what happens. Let's see what happens. It's all going to work out.
So you think it wasn't members of your administration who wanted
Say it?
Are you saying you think it wasn't intentional to strike the drone?
I don't know. I find it hard to believe it was intentional, if you want to know the truth. I think that it could have been somebody who was loose and stupid that did it. But we'll be able to report back, and you'll understand exactly what happened. But it was a very foolish move. That I can tell you.
Do you feel like there are members of your administration who are trying to push you into conflict?
No, not at all. Not at all. In fact, in many cases, it's the opposite. But I will say, look, I said, I want to get out of these endless wars. I campaigned on that. I want to get out. We've been in Afghanistan for 19 years. As you know, we've reduced very substantially in Afghanistan. We beat the caliphate. We took back 100% of the caliphate. When it was 99%, Justin, I said, we're going to get out. We're going to start peeling back. And everybody went crazy because it was 99. So I said, all right, so we'll finish it up. So we got 100%. And we're pulling that back out of Syria. We're pulling a lot of people back. But this is a new wrinkle. This is a new fly in the ointment, what happened shooting down the drone. And this country will not stand for it. That I can tell you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for CNN. Let's go. Thank you.
CNN. Thank you very much. Let's go. Let's go. Let's go. Press, let's go. Thank you. Let's go. Thank you. Press, thank you. All right. Thank you.
We're leaving now, CNN. Thank you.
A very important conversation between the President of the United States, the Prime Minister of Canada, and reporters in the Oval Office discussing many big issues, relationships with China, the prospects for the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. I'm going to set those aside, though, to talk about the moment of war and peace that dominated the discussions between the President, the Prime Minister, and the reporters there. President Trump saying, and this is very important, he thinks somebody made a mistake. A general or somebody else made a mistake in Iran in shooting down an American drone. The President saying it would have made a big difference had that been a manned aircraft as opposed to an unmanned aircraft. aircraft, and he's saying somebody was, quote, loose and stupid in Iran. The president there, even though he also said we'll see if there is a U.S. military response, seeming to de-escalate, if you will, not directly blaming the Iranian government, not escalating his rhetoric there. Our CNN's Caitlin Collins is live at the White House. Caitlin, as the president took those questions there, he seemed to be saying that what he believes, and one assumes he has been briefed by intelligence officials about this, is that the Revolutionary Guard, forgive the term, got out over its skis perhaps here. It did something that surprised even its own government.
Yeah, and John, I was in the room there and I asked the president, what does the intelligence show? Does it show that? Because that was the president there making news for the first time, saying that he thinks this was an actual mistake by someone in the Iranian government to shoot down this U.S. drone. Now, of course, he didn't say how the United States is going to respond, but that was in response to my question, do you still think Iran is a different country? That's a statement that the president has made several times, saying essentially he believes that they've changed their behavior since he has gotten in office. So you see the president there saying that, but that is news there that the president was saying he thinks that they made a mistake about this. He thinks it was some general potentially who may have made the decision to shoot this drone down, saying that they were being loose and stupid. So the question now is that going to change how the president responds to this? Because they've been pretty clear so far based on what CENTCOM has said about shooting down that drone, that it was the Iranians, that it wasn't over Iranian airspace, that it was over international waters, which the president did tell reporters there in the Oval Office that is clearly documented. But every time we asked what is going to be your next action, the president would not telegraph that because he said he didn't think that would be a smart decision. He only said that we will see. But of course, John, a big deal there that the president is saying he thinks it might have been an actual mistake that Iran shot down that U.S. military drone.
He kind of at times changed his tone and his emphasis within the course of an hour, let alone a day, but very important there. Took that at the President of the United States, trying to create a little bit more space for himself and perhaps for the Iranian government as they try to work this out. While the President was speaking to the Prime Minister in the Oval Office, the Pentagon releasing what it says is more evidence about what happened. CNN's Barbara Starr is live at the Pentagon. Barbara, a video, what are we talking about?
We have a very short video clip to show the viewers, John, and we'll try and keep playing it. The Pentagon releasing this black and white video a short time ago that it says shows the smoke trail of the U.S. military drone being shot down over the Strait of Hormuz. You're going to see that black smoke trail come into view. Very short, very brief video clip. Not the best quality, the Pentagon knows, but they are adamant that this is the shoot down of the U.S. military drone over the Strait of Hormuz. Let's unpack a little bit more as we look at this of what the president had to say. He is saying this may have been a mistake. How could the President of the United States reasonably know that? You would have to have either perhaps intercepts, eavesdropping of conversations between Iranian commanders and government officials that would tell you it's a mistake. You would have to have some understanding that the launch point on the coast of Iran was not under government control, that it might have been the Revolutionary Guard Corps acting on its own. You would have to come to an awful lot of conclusions. You would have to have the assessment that the government does not control the Revolutionary Guard Corps, and in some cases they don't fully. This is a proxy, very militant wing of the Iranian securities forces, and they often do go out on their own. So if this is all true, that it's a mistake, it becomes even more dangerous because the U.S. has to make the calculation of what part of the Iranian regime is behind any incident that it sees and how to respond to it. And that may be exactly what you mentioned a moment ago, the president creating some space to make some decisions, to get some advice here about what to do. We know the president is looking at the possibility of military options. It's exactly what you would expect him to do. His advisors are there today at the White House. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff arrived a short time ago. He weighs in when there are discussions of military options, obviously. But the president also trying to really, dampen this down a bit, give himself some space, not taking on the Iranian military directly at this point. We will have to see. We just simply don't know what he's going to decide. This attack is somewhat different. This is a direct attack on a U.S. asset in international airspace. But as the president said, it wasn't an attack on U.S. troops. This was an unmanned drone collecting intelligence on Iran. No U.S. troops involved in this. If it went to that next step, perhaps a different outcome. John?
Barbara Starr, live at the Pentagon for us. Let's bring the conversation back in the room. Admiral Kirby, I'll start with you again. Your mixed experience, State Department and the Pentagon. Do you agree the president was trying to create some space for himself there? But still, even if you think this was a loose cannon or a loose unit or a provocative element of the Revolutionary Guard, which has happened before in history, they still shot a U.S. military drone down. So one assumes there will be some response. And I'll add lastly, I don't expect, even if the Iranian government right now is trying to figure out what happened, if this was somebody, as the president says, being, quote, loose and stupid, they're not going to raise their hand and say, sorry, that's not the way they work. So what happens now?
Right. In a way, he has created a little bit of maneuver room for himself, but in another way, it's continued to be closed down around him because the Revolutionary Guard is not fully accountable to the Iranian state government. They report to the supreme leader.
And forgive me, they were also accountable, the administration says, for those tanker attacks. So is this part of a pattern?
Exactly.
Of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard trying to provoke a confrontation?
Remember, they are the hardliners. And nobody hated the Iran deal more than them, other than maybe Trump. And they, just a month or so ago, a Revolutionary Guard commander was calling for regime change in his own country. There are tensions between them and the Rouhani government. So to a degree, yes, he's giving himself a little bit of space, but he also, I'm sure, is mindful that these guys operate on their own timetable and according to their own precepts. And there's still a very dangerous force that has to be dealt with. If you strike them, which certainly, you could be considering doing that. You have to remember that they also have outposts and proxies in Iraq and elsewhere. They can do great damage to U.S. forces and assets elsewhere outside of Iran.
And from your experience, the top advisor to the president right now would be either John Bolton or the Secretary of State. There's an acting defense secretary. The one who's leaving, the president hasn't really loved to begin with. The one who's coming in is new to the job. Where is Pompeo's head at this moment when the president's asking for his options?
Well, Secretary Pompeo has been suspiciously quiet this morning. We heard him at the State Department rolling out a report of human trafficking. He didn't say anything when it came to Iran. We haven't seen him tweet. We know that he was in the meeting at the White House on this today, but that was alongside the other officials. But it is his voice that we have seen sort of muted over the past few days. Over the weekend, he said that a military option was on the table, and then when he visited CENTCOM down in Florida, he didn't say that so explicitly, and that was after we saw President Trump saying he doesn't want to go to war with Iran. So we know that Pompeo and Bolton are both Iran hawks, but the question is, are they willing to voice that opinion so openly at the risk of receiving the ire of the president?
Yeah, the one thing I would note is that unlike John Bolton, who makes his views very clear, Secretary Pompeo is very careful never to get out in front of the president. That's why you're not hearing him right now.
Even just yesterday, tweeting again, the president does not want war.
Yeah, I was just going to say, not only are there cross currents inside the administration, but also you made a good point earlier in terms of the president pulls people on a regular basis, and he's also getting cross currents from Capitol Hill. He spoke to Lindsey Graham this morning. He speaks to Senator Tom Cotton regularly. They are calling for a robust response, a strike, a military strike. They're not necessarily unified in the Republican conference. He's hearing from people inside the Republican Party on Capitol Hill calling for more restraint. So it's on several levels, people taking different views on this. And as we've said repeatedly, it's the president's decision, and he's going to have to define what proportional is and how far he's willing to go right now. And that's the big outstanding question.
And a short time ago, you mentioned the Republicans. The top Democrat in the United States, Speaker Nancy Pelosi, telling CNN we need to de-escalate right now, was how she put it. The question is how. CNN Global Affairs analyst Aaron David Miller joins us live from the Wilson Center. Aaron, you've worked for several Secretary of States. You've done negotiations in this delicate region. Connect the dots of today. Iran acknowledges it shot down a drone. The Iranian government says the drone was in Iranian airspace. The Pentagon says that's a lie. The president says he thinks it was a loose and stupid act. Now what?
Well, maybe the intel suggests that, in fact, it was, that these operations are not highly or centrally coordinated. But the problem, John, I think, is this. You have a preternaturally risk-averse president, and right now, I think, an Iranian regime that is actually quite risk-ready. And the administration has put an enormous stock on this in this question of deterrence. They've deployed military assets. Their rhetoric suggests they don't want war, but they want to deter. And now, even if this was a loose cannon act by an Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps unit, you have the problem that a $150 million drone, no one was killed, and maybe that impressed the president as well. I suspect that, and the way the president's been talking, you'll see, it's a big mistake, that at some point, whether it's today or tomorrow, there's going to be a response. Second point, I don't see the off-ramp here. If in fact we were hours or days away from a deconfliction channel, a hotline, some device designed to create political space, jaw to jaw rather than war, as Churchill would say, I'd feel a lot more confident that there's a margin here for extrication. I don't see that right now.
Don't see that right now. Admiral Kirby, you wanted to weigh in on that.
Well, yeah, if you remember when our sailors were taken, they were in these 2 patrol boats, they strayed into Iranian waters. Secretary Kerry was able to get on the phone with Foreign Minister Zarif within the hour of the news, and within 24 hours was able to get not just the sailors, but the boats back, because we had a channel of communication that the Iran deal gave us, direct communications. This administration has blown that all up, and the only channel of communications are back channel, and they're not the most effective. They have limited themselves in their ability to try to affect an off-ramp.
To that point, Aaron David Miller, if we needed to create a back channel, because if we don't have a good one at the moment, who or what might it be?
Well, I think there are any number of ways, and John knows this, he was there to create all kinds of back channels. Even if we were ready to jaw, the real question is whether the Supreme Leader and the Iranians are ready, without first demonstrating that they're under tremendous pressure and pain, and they need to demonstrate. This event was widely televised and announced within the Islamic Republic. So it's clear they've set an escalation frame here, and it would take both sides and a lot of will right now in the middle of this thing to create some sort of de-escalation. I think it's going to get worse, John, before it gets worse.
Aaron David Miller. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, not on that point, on something separate. I just told several sources that the White House has invited congressional leaders and key committee chairs and ranking members to the White House for a Situation Room briefing on Iran this afternoon. So this is continuing to move forward, and they're continuing to try and loop in Capitol Hill, which is a shift from the past couple of weeks that they've really deployed over the course of the last couple of days.
Just a fraction of that sentence tells you what you need to know. Situation Room briefing on Iran at the White House, a big major day of breaking news. Thanks for joining us. Inside Politics.